Okay, you will continue taking Reconstruction notes. So you're going to pick up where you left off with part 1. So Reconstruction, part 2, just to remind you our big questions. Did the end of the war and the end of slavery lead to a peace based on liberty and justice for all? And then our second question, did these events bring African Americans closer to enjoying all the ideals? Let's see. So now we're at Roman numeral 3, Interracial Democracy. This picture shows Ulysses S. Grant, Henry Wilson, his running mate, and they were running under the Republican ticket in 1868. So election of 1868, and this is Ulysses S. Grant wins with the help of 1 million African American votes, and actually more whites voted for his opponent, Seymour, but because of the 1 million African American votes, Ulysses S. Grant won. And he was, of course, Ulysses S. Grant was the general of the Union Army and was immensely popular in the North, and certainly amongst African American voters looking for somebody who was going to look out for their needs. And that was part of his campaign, was that he was going to provide protection and support for African Americans. So this is the first time a president was elected with the black vote. 15th Amendment was created under Grant's presidency, and it was made in 1870, and it declared that states cannot deny anyone the right to vote because of race or color or because the person was once enslaved. So we're seeing more of an interracial democracy now, where now there's greater protections for people that were formerly enslaved or African Americans. And this was limited, though, to adult males. Women could still not vote. Okay, interracial democracy continued. This shows Robert Elliot speaking in Congress. So African Americans in office. A fifth of the South's elected leadership was made up of African Americans. And they served in every southern state legislature. So at the state level, every state had African Americans represented. And there were 2 U.S. senators that were African American and 22 U.S. members of Congress. And that was in the early stages of Reconstruction, so at the time of Grant. Work with white leadership to rebuild the South. So the work that's going on here is the work to rebuild the South. And so the black voice was very strong, or relatively strong at that time, and we're working together to rebuild in a place that formerly enslaved them. Roman numeral 4, this is violence and backlash. This shows a woman looking back at these hooded members of the Ku Klux Klan. So the Ku Klux Klan, or the KKK, was a secret society designed to drive blacks out of public life, meaning voting, as well as out of office, so keep them from running or getting elected. And they used violence as a threat to black voters, as well as office holders, as well as people that may support African Americans, whether they were whites that were going to vote for African Americans or white jurors that may support African Americans on a court case. They used intimidation and violence as their main tactic. In a response, the enforcement acts were made under Grant's presidency. And in 1870, they were made to protect black voters. However, those arrested were seldom convicted. This is because jurors in these court cases were often threatened by the KKK. So they would often let the convicted people off. Or those found guilty, they were not found guilty. This says, edict to shun qualification, the black man or other be educated, and he can vote with us whites. So notice there's a lot of misspellings in there. And this is probably outside of a voting house. And so you're going to see that part of the violence and backlash had something to do with restricting voting rights of African Americans. And this is also supposed to be like Uncle Sam writing that. So, limiting right to vote. This is also during Reconstruction. Oftentimes taxes, because African Americans, remember, a lot were in debt because of sharecropping, so did not have much money, but taxes were placed on voting. That would keep people from voting. Literacy tests were placed on voting because a number of African Americans never learned to read, did not have that opportunity. And what are called grandfather clauses, and that just meant if your grandfather voted or could vote, then you could vote. Well, of course, in the initial stages of Reconstruction, African Americans were newly freed. Their grandfathers could not vote, so they couldn't vote. And these were used in the South to deny blacks the right to vote. However, this points out that a lot of times the whites that went to vote also couldn't pass the literacy tests or the tests that were put in front of them in order to vote. That's why they made these grandfather clauses. So those whites that could not read could also vote, or that could simply not pass the literacy test could also vote. And then Jim Crow laws. So these are laws enforcing segregation of blacks and whites in the South after the Civil War. And there's a series of them, and they're the ones that are famously lived all the way into the 1960s. Part of the civil rights movement was to get rid of those Jim Crow laws that existed. And here's an example of a Jim Crow law. Right here, you have the white drinking fountain and the black drinking fountain. Which one looks nicer? So Plessy versus Ferguson. This was a court case, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court. And African Americans argued that Jim Crow violated the 14th Amendment's guarantee of equal protection of the law, making African Americans full citizens. So a man named Plessy, Homer Plessy, refused to sit on a car that was designated for blacks, refused to sit in that car, but sit in the white area. And what came out of this is the Supreme Court decides that Jim Crow or JC laws did not violate the 14th Amendment as long as the facilities available to both races were roughly equal. So if the bathrooms were equal, if the schools were equal, if the drinking fountains were equal, then it was okay. And the Supreme Court justice who tipped the scales on this case was formerly an owner of enslaved people. And you can see here that clearly they are not equal. And resilience. So let's go back here. These are exoduses, or African Americans leaving the Deep South to go in different directions to find work and opportunities and jobs. And this is part of resilience. So, response to segregation. African American migrations. So blacks migrate to the African country of Liberia. Not many went, but some did go back to Liberia to set up settlements. Or northern cities. You can see them going north to cities like a Chicago or a Detroit to seek work, or western settlements to work out in these new towns that are forming in the West, or all the way out to California to find job opportunities. Most African Americans remained in the South, however. And in 1865, 2,000 there were 2,000 black-owned businesses right after the Civil War. By 1903, there were 25,000, and that is in the South. And also, 5% of African Americans were literate in 1865, but by 1900, 15% were literate. So there was some progress being made in the South itself, despite all the segregation and Jim Crow laws that existed. This is evidence of resilience, of people fighting back. Okay, that is the end of part 2.